The greatest illusion of the Soviet Union was the ruble, a piece of paper that promised equality but delivered nothing but empty hands in a desert of scarcity, while the United States was perfecting the ultimate machine of mass abundance, where the only limit to what you could consume was your own ambition. In the American 1980s, the supermarket was the true cathedral of freedom, a place where a blue-collar worker could walk into a neon-lit palace of choice and find 30 different types of cereal, fresh produce from every corner of the globe, and meat that didn't require a bribe to obtain. The American system understood that human dignity starts with a full stomach, creating a supply chain so efficient it became the envy of the world. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet citizen lived in a parallel reality where money was a joke and the only true currency was Blat, a dark, parasitic web of personal connections, favors, and corruption that determined who ate steak and who ate bone. This fundamental clash between a system of open wealth and a system of hidden privilege is the reason why the USSR didn't just collapse politically. It starved itself to death while its leaders feasted in secret behind mahogany doors. The contrast in The Grocery Experience and The Ritual of the Line revealed a psychological torture that no American could truly grasp. In the US, shopping was an afterthought, a 20-minute convenience where the biggest stress was choosing between brands. The American grocery store was a testament to the victory of logistics, where shelves were restocked by invisible armies of truckers and farmers to ensure that the customer is king. In the USS, shopping was a full-time job of endurance. A Soviet citizen spent an average of 2 hours a day standing in gray, freezing lines for basic staples like bread, milk, or eggs, never knowing if the supply would last until they reached the counter. This wasn't just a shortage. It was a state-mandated humiliation, where the people were forced to beg the state for the right to survive, a system that turned every citizen into a desperate scavenger, searching for the blue chicken of legend, while the American housewife was deciding which cut of prime rib to buy for a Tuesday night dinner, a difference that turned the simple act of eating into a daily struggle for survival in a land that claimed to be a paradise. The role of Berezka stores and the apartheid of the elite exposed the sickening hypocrisy of the classless society in the US. The rich lived better than the poor, but they shopped in the same world, using the same currency, and subject to the same market forces. There was no secret dollar that only a senator could use. In the USSR, the state created a vile two-tiered reality where the Communist Party elite had access to Berezka stores, hidden sanctuaries of Western luxury where they could buy French cognac, Japanese electronics, and high-quality meat using special certificates that were illegal for ordinary workers to possess, while the proletariat fought over rotted potatoes in the state shops. The vanguards of the revolution were living like 19th-century aristocrats, protected by the KGB and fed by the very capitalist systems they publicly condemned. This wasn't corruption. It was a feudal system disguised as socialism, where the masters of the state lived in the 21st century while the people were trapped in a permanent 1945, a betrayal of the ideology so total it left the population with a deep, burning resentment that would eventually explode. The contrast in The Shadow Economy and the Corruption of the Soul turned every Soviet citizen into a petty criminal just to stay alive. In the US, the black market was a fringe world of drugs and illegal goods, while the mainstream economy was governed by contracts, receipts, and the rule of law. The American could trust that the price on the tag was the price they paid. In the USSR, the second economy was the only economy that worked. If you wanted a decent pair of shoes, a spare part for your car, or even a piece of fresh fruit, you had to find someone who had access, offer a bribe, or trade a favor. This culture of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, corrupted every level of society, from the doctor who took gifts for better medicine to the shopkeeper who hid the best meat under the counter for their special friends. The American system rewarded productivity. The Soviet system rewarded cunning and deceit, creating a society where honesty was a weakness and survival required a constant, exhausting dance of lies and underground deals, a moral erosion that turned the entire nation into a giant, desperate bribe-taking machine. The final contrast in this first part is the myth of the cheap ruble versus the reality of purchasing power, which was the state's biggest statistical lie. The Soviet propaganda machine loved to brag that rent was cheap and bread cost pennies, but they never mentioned that there was no bread to buy at that price. In the US, prices were higher, but they were real, a reflection of value and availability that allowed the worker to plan their life and save for the future. The American dollar was a tool of empowerment. The Soviet ruble was a propaganda token that lost all meaning the moment you stepped into a shop with empty shelves. This empty ruble created a psychological trap where people had savings they couldn't spend and needs they couldn't fulfill. A disconnect that turned the economy into a theater of the absurd, where the state pretended to pay its workers and the workers pretended to work, while the true wealth of the nation was being siphoned off by a corrupt bureaucracy that was more interested in building nuclear silos than in filling the dinner plates of its own people, a hollow shell of an empire that was one bad harvest away from total collapse. The war of ideologies was ultimately won not by missiles, but by denim and consumer electronics, a battlefield where the Soviet Union's heavy industry proved useless against the American genius for lifestyle innovation. In the United States, the 1970s and 80s were an explosion of personal expression, where the mass market provided every citizen with access to high-quality clothing, home appliances, and the latest gadgets that made life easier and more vibrant. The American worker didn't just have clothes. They had fashion and choice, a system where competition drove prices down and quality up, ensuring that even a teenager with a part-time job could afford the same brands worn by movie stars. In the USSR, consumer goods were treated as an afterthought, a low-priority sector of the planned economy that produced stiff, ugly, and outdated clothing that no one wanted to wear. This created a society of gray people on the surface, while underneath, a feverish obsession with Western goods was rotting the foundations of communist loyalty, a difference that turned a pair of Levi's jeans into a subversive political statement and a microwave into a miracle that the Soviet state simply could not replicate. The contrast in The Denim Underground and the Price of Style revealed a desperate hunger for Western identity that the KGB could not suppress. In the US, blue jeans were the uniform of the common man, durable, cheap, and available in every corner store from New York to California. They represented the democratization of comfort. In the USSR, a pair of genuine American jeans cost as much as 2 months' salary and could only be bought from fartsovщики, black market dealers, in dark alleys or behind closed doors. The Soviet state tried to produce its own socialist jeans, but they were made of stiff, cardboard-like fabric that didn't fade and looked pathetic compared to the real thing. This obsession with the West created a black market empire where people risked prison sentences just to wear a piece of American cotton, proving that the Soviet new man didn't want the glory of the revolution. He wanted the freedom of the American mall, a psychological defeat that showed the party had lost the hearts and minds of its youth to the power of a brand name. The role of household slavery and the tech gap showed how the Soviet state failed its women by ignoring the domestic revolution. In the US, the 1980s saw the standard American kitchen become a high-tech laboratory of efficiency, with reliable dishwashers, frost-free freezers, and sophisticated food processors that liberated millions of hours of human labor. The American home was a center of convenience and leisure. In the USSR, domestic technology was a joke. Refrigerators that sounded like tank engines and leaked oil, washing machines that were essentially vibrating tubs with manual rollers, and vacuum cleaners that blew more dust than they sucked up. The Soviet woman was a slave to the machine, spending her weekends doing manual labor because the state prioritized the production of steel over the production of a decent toaster. This technological stagnation wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a drain on the nation's soul, as the second superpower proved it could build a titanium submarine, but couldn't build a reliable vacuum cleaner for its people. The contrast in the repair culture and the scarcity of parts turned every Soviet man into an amateur mechanic out of pure necessity. In the US, the disposable culture, while often criticized, provided a level of reliability and service that meant if an appliance broke, it was fixed in days or replaced in hours. A system backed by massive inventories of spare parts and a competitive service industry in the USSR, buying a car or a TV was only the beginning of the nightmare, as there were virtually no official repair shops and no spare parts available through legal channels. This created a nation of kulabins, men who spent their nights soldering broken circuit boards with salvaged wires or fixing car engines with pieces of rubber hose and scrap metal. This forced self-reliance was praised by the state as socialist ingenuity. But it was actually a symptom of a systemic collapse, where the citizens had to act as the spare parts for a government that had abandoned its responsibility to maintain the infrastructure of life. The final contrast in this part is the gift of luxury versus the bribe of necessity, which redefined the meaning of the word present. In the US, a gift was an expression of affection, a toy for a child, a piece of jewelry for a spouse, or a luxury item meant to surprise and delight. The American gift-giving culture was a celebration of abundance and surplus. In the USSR, a gift was often a strategic bribe. You gave a bottle of French perfume to a doctor to get a better room in the hospital, a box of imported chocolates to a clerk to get a phone line installed, or a carton of American cigarettes to a mechanic to get your car fixed. The luxury item was a weapon of negotiation, a currency more valuable than the ruble because it could open doors that were locked to the common man. This turned every social interaction into a transaction and every friendship into a potential connection. A moral rot that proved that in a system of total deficit, the only way to remain a human being was to become a merchant of the black market. The tragedy of the Soviet dream was most visible in the four walls of the communal apartment, a space where the state's failure to provide basic shelter turned life into a permanent conflict. In the United States, the post-war era saw the largest housing boom in human history, where the suburban revolution allowed millions of middle-class families to own their own homes, complete with private yards, multiple bedrooms, and the fundamental right to privacy. The American home was a fortress of individual liberty, supported by a transparent mortgage system that allowed a worker to trade their labor for a piece of the earth. In the USSR, housing was a weapon of social control, a scarce resource distributed by the state based on loyalty, seniority, and Blat. While the propaganda boasted of free apartments, the reality was a decades-long waiting list where families of 3 generations were forced to live in a single room, sharing a kitchen and a bathroom with 5 other families. This forced intimacy wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a psychological tool that broke the privacy of the soul, ensuring that the state was always present in your most intimate moments, a difference that made the American white picket fence a symbol of success and the Soviet Khrushcheva a symbol of state-managed claustrophobia. The contrast in the telephone right and the hierarchy of access revealed how the Soviet legal system was replaced by a secret code of favors. In the US, the law was a public, predictable framework. If you had the money, you could buy a car, install a phone line, or fly across the country, and the government had no legal right to stop you based on your connections. The American system functioned on universal accessibility. In the USSR, there was the telefonoi pravo, telephone law, where a single call from a party official could override any law, any waiting list, and any person's rights if you were a nobody. You waited 15 years for a telephone line. If you knew the cousin of a regional secretary, you had it in a day. This created a society where your identity was your currency, and the shadow bureaucracy of favors became more powerful than the official government. A difference that turned the US into a society of contracts and the USSR into a society of clans, where the only way to get justice or basic services was to find someone who could resolve the issue through a private conversation. The role of speculation and the criminalization of trade turned the most basic human instinct to buy and sell into a crime against the state. In the US, the middleman was a respected part of the economy, the entrepreneur who brought goods to market and earned a profit for their efficiency and risk. The American system celebrated the merchant. In the USSR. Any form of private trade was branded as speculation and was punishable by years in prison or even death during the harsher eras. Yet because the state shops were empty, the speculant was the only person who actually kept the country running, secretly bringing clothes, food, and medicine to those who could afford them. This created a schizophrenic society where everyone hated the black marketeer in public but begged for their help in private. A hypocrisy that turned the entire population into unwilling criminals, proving that a state that outlaws the market will eventually find its entire economy operating in the shadows. The contrast in the waiting list as a tool of submission showed how the Soviet state used deficit to keep the people on their knees. In the US, if you wanted a new car, you went to a dealership, chose your color, and drove home that afternoon. A simple act of consumer choice that fueled the greatest industrial engine in history. In the USSR, buying a car was a 10-year psychological war. You first had to get permission from your workplace, then stand on a list, and then pray that when your turn finally came, the state hadn't increased the price or canceled the production run. This economy of waiting ensured that the citizen was always in a position of a suppliant, someone who was perpetually waiting for a gift from the state rather than a consumer who was demanding a service. This manufactured scarcity was a form of political leverage. The state knew that a man who has been waiting 10 years for a Leda is a man who will not protest in the streets for fear of losing his place in line. The final contrast in this part is the total immobility versus the freedom of the road, which defined the limits of human ambition. In the US, the car was the great liberator, allowing a person to live in one city and work in another, or to pack their bags and move 3,000 miles away in search of a better life. The American system was a liquid society of constant movement. In the USSR, you were shackled to your propiska, residence permit, a document that made it illegal for you to live or work in a city where you weren't officially registered because housing and food were tied to the state plan. Moving to a better city like Moscow was a luxury reserved for the elite or those with massive bribes. This turned the Soviet Union into a modern feudalism, where the proletariat were effectively serfs tied to their factory or their collective farm, a difference that meant an American was defined by where they could go, while a Soviet was defined by where they were forbidden to leave. A static, rotting empire where the people were trapped in their own poverty by a wall of red tape and a state that feared nothing more than a person who was free to move. The ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union was not triggered by a military invasion or a nuclear exchange, but by the total psychological surrender of its people to the reality of their own poverty. A moment when the citizen realized that the bright future was never coming, and that the state's ideology was nothing but a shroud for a dying empire. In the United States, the 1980s were a period of intense economic expansion and the refinement of the global supply chain, where the market proved its ability to deliver quality and abundance to even the most remote corners of the nation. The American system didn't just survive. It thrived by becoming more responsive to human desire, proving that a society that values the consumer's choice is inherently more stable than one that ignores it. In the USSR, the state had reached a terminal point where it could no longer even feed its own people without importing wheat from the West, a humiliation that showed the superpower was a giant with hollow legs, a system that had spent its treasure on missiles while its people were hunting for toilet paper and basic sausages, a difference in priorities that made the final collapse of the Berlin Wall more like a prison break toward a supermarket than a political revolution. The contrast in the image of the enemy versus the attraction of the brand showed that the Soviet propaganda machine was powerless against the allure of the American lifestyle. In the US, the image of the Soviet Union was one of a gray, joyless ant hill, a stereotype that, while exaggerated, was rooted in the visible reality of Soviet life. The American system didn't need propaganda to sell itself. It had Hollywood, MTV, and Coca-Cola, which acted as a cultural soft power that penetrated the Iron Curtain more effectively than any spy. In the USSR, the state spent billions telling its people that Americans were starving and homeless. But when Soviet citizens saw a simple Sears catalog or an American film, they didn't see capitalist oppression. They saw refrigerators full of food and families in clean, colorful clothes. This cognitive dissonance broke the back of communist loyalty as the people realized their government was lying not just about the West, but about the possibility of a better life, a difference that turned every imported Western product into a Trojan horse of freedom that slowly dismantled the Soviet mind from the inside out. The role of Gorbachev's grocery store visit remains the most symbolic moment of the Cold War's end, a realization that even the highest leaders of the USSR knew the game was over when Soviet officials visited American supermarkets and saw the overwhelming abundance, the stacks of fresh pineapples, the dozens of varieties of cheese, the aisles of pet food. They were reportedly physically stunned, believing at first that it was a staged Potemkin village created to fool them. The American system was so far ahead in the basic art of human survival that it rendered the Soviet ideology irrelevant, a realization that forced the Kremlin into the desperate reforms of perestroika and glasnost, trying to inject market forces into a system that was already brain-dead. The American system succeeded because it was built from the bottom up by millions of individual choices. The Soviet system failed because it was imposed from the top down by a handful of men who had forgotten what it was like to stand in a breadline, a difference that ensured when the lid was finally lifted, the entire pressure cooker of Soviet society exploded in a rush toward the exit. The contrast in the inheritance of scarcity versus the legacy of wealth continues to shape the world today, as the former Soviet republics struggle to overcome the psychology of the deficit that was burned into their collective DNA for 70 years. In the US, the legacy of the Cold War era is an infrastructure of unparalleled consumption and distribution, a world where the primary problem is no longer scarcity, but excess, a challenge of abundance that, while complex, is a luxury that billions of people would die for. In the post-Soviet space, the memory of the empty shelf and the blue chicken created a society obsessed with conspicuous consumption and sudden wealth, a desperate attempt to compensate for decades of state-mandated poverty. This PTSD of the ruble has fueled the rise of oligarchs and a brutal form of capitalism that mirrors the corruption of the old Blat system. A difference that proves that while you can change a government in a day, it takes generations to heal the soul of a nation that was taught to view a loaf of bread as a victory and a neighbor as a rival for a piece of meat. The final verdict on the economic Cold War is that the United States didn't just have better technology. It had a better understanding of the human heart, recognizing that the desire for comfort, choice, and dignity is more powerful than any political slogan or military parade. The Soviet Union was a 70-year experiment in the suppression of the self, an attempt to build a civilization that ignored the most basic needs of the individual in favor of the abstract glory of the state. Its collapse was a natural rejection by the human organism, a refusal to live any longer in a world where money was a lie and life was a line. The American citizen possessed the power of the purchase, a voice that shaped the world through the simple act of choosing. The Soviet citizen was silenced until they had nothing left but their hunger. And the end of the Cold War was the moment the world looked at the golden arches opening in Moscow and realized that the Red Star had finally been outshone by the neon signs of the market, a tragedy that proves the greatest strength of any nation is not the size of its nuclear arsenal, but the depth of its pantry and the freedom of its people to fill it. What do you think? Was the bigger danger to the Soviet citizen the lack of technology in the public hospital, or the existence of the secret Kremlin clinic for the elite? Share your thoughts below.